The whole room shifted the moment he walked in, and nobody said a word about it. That was the thing about Douglas Hartwell. He had a way of changing the atmosphere without trying. He wasn't loud. He wasn't polished in the way that the Sutherland Group's senior partners were polished. That particular brand of confidence that came from too many expense account dinners and not enough doubt. Douglas wore a gray wool blazer that had been pressed, but not recently, and his shoes were clean but not new. And when he stepped into the atrium of the Rideau Club on that cold Thursday evening in November, he looked like a man who had come because he was expected to, not because he wanted to. He had been a structural engineer with Sutherland Group for 11 years. In that time, he had overseen the redesign of 3 provincial highway corridors, consulted on the Queensway expansion, and quietly flagged a foundation error on the Eastview office complex that would have cost the firm $40 million and a class action lawsuit. Nobody had thrown him a party for that last one. He hadn't expected them to. His daughter Meredith was 12 and lived primarily with her mother in Canada. Every Wednesday and every second weekend she belonged to Douglas. On those days he made her scrambled eggs with dill, and they watched nature documentaries, and she talked without stopping, and he listened like it was the most important thing he would ever do, because it was. He got himself a glass of sparkling water from the bar and stood near the tall windows that looked out over Wellington Street. The snow had started again, the fine dry kind that doesn't accumulate so much as drift, and the streetlights made it look like static. He watched it for a moment before he remembered where he was. The Sutherland Group's annual Winter Gala was held at the Rideau Club every year without fail, a tradition that predated the current senior partners and would likely outlast them. 200 people in a heritage room with 16-foot ceilings, and a quartet in the far corner playing something that was technically jazz, but had been drained of everything that made jazz worth listening to. Douglas went every year. He shook the right hands and ate the miniature crab cakes and left before 10. This year, he almost hadn't come. Meredith had a science project due Friday, and he'd spent Tuesday night helping her trace tectonic plates onto tracing paper. And something about that felt more real than anything waiting at the Rideau Club. But his manager, Keith Belanger, had sent 3 reminder emails in 10 days, which was Keith's way of saying that Douglas's presence was non-negotiable. So here he was. He looked around the room without any particular purpose. That was when he saw her. She was standing near the east wall, just past the edge of the string lights that someone had strung along the wainscoting in a way that was probably supposed to feel festive. She held a glass of white wine with both hands, the way people do when they need something to hold on to. Her dress was dark blue, simple, and she wore her hair pulled back with a few strands loose at the temples, and she was watching the room with the careful expression of someone trying very hard not to look like they were watching it. Her name was Naomi Clearwater. Douglas knew who she was. She worked in the contracts division, had been with Sutherland Group for about 3 years. He had crossed paths with her twice, once on a project review and once in the elevator, and both times she had struck him as competent and precise and not the type to waste either her time or yours. He had not spoken to her at length. He didn't speak to many people at length. He noticed, and then he tried not to notice, and then he couldn't stop noticing. No one was going to her. It was the kind of thing you could miss if you weren't paying attention. The party moved the way parties do, in currents and eddies, people gravitating toward each other and breaking apart. But those currents were moving around Naomi Clearwater the way water moves around a stone. People looked at her and then looked away. A cluster of women from the accounts team passed within arm's reach of her without slowing. Peter Ashmore from business development, who was the type to introduce himself to everyone within a 10-foot radius, executed what appeared to be a deliberate course correction to avoid that section of the wall entirely. Douglas watched this for longer than he should have. He had attended enough company events to understand that these things were never random. Social exclusion at a professional gathering required coordination, even if that coordination was unspoken. Somebody had decided something about Naomi Clearwater, and then other people had decided to agree, the way people at companies always eventually agreed with whoever controlled the most risk to their advancement. He took a slow sip of his water. He knew the name Warren Clearwater, of course. Everyone at Sutherland Group knew Warren Clearwater. He had been a project manager in the infrastructure division before he was quietly reassigned and then quietly let go. A process that had taken about 8 months and generated the kind of institutional gossips that circulates in whispered half-sentences and knowing looks. What Douglas knew for certain was this: Warren Clearwater had cost the firm a significant contract through a combination of bad judgment and worse ethics, and the partners had eventually cut the loss. What he had only just now assembled into a complete picture was the fact that Naomi was Warren's ex-wife, that she had kept his name or had been slow to change it, and that the people at this party had looked at that name and made a decision. It wasn't complicated. It was just profoundly unfair. Douglas set his glass down on a nearby table. He thought about Meredith. He thought about the particular humiliation of walking into a room where people have already formed an opinion about you before you've opened your mouth. He thought about the Wednesday evenings when Meredith came to his apartment quiet, in a way that told him something had happened at school that she wasn't ready to talk about yet, and how he had learned to be present without pressing, to let the silence be company instead of pressure. He thought about what it cost a person to keep showing up to rooms that didn't want them. He straightened his jacket. He could finish his water and check the clock and find Keith and shake hands and leave at 9:30. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. It cost him nothing. He walked across the room instead. He moved at an unhurried pace, not the pace of someone executing a mission, but the pace of someone who happened to be moving in that direction, and he stopped a few feet from Naomi Clearwater and waited until she noticed him, which took a moment because she had been studying a framed map of the Ottawa Valley on the wall with what he suspected was not genuine interest. She looked up. Something complicated moved through her expression. "I don't think we've been properly introduced," Douglas said. Douglas Hartwell, Infrastructure Division. She studied him for a half-second with the wariness of someone who had been surprised too many times that evening by things that turned out not to be what they seemed. "Naomi Clearwater," she said. "Contracts. I know," he said. "You flagged the subclause issue on the Merivale tender last spring. Saved the project about 3 weeks of revision." She blinked. "You knew about that?" "I was on the adjacent file. I noticed the correction in the documentation. It was good work." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her recalibrating. "Thank you," she said, and it came out more careful than warm, which he understood. She had been in this room for over an hour. She had good reasons to be careful. "These things are easier with someone to stand with," Douglas said. He wasn't looking at her as he said it. He was looking at the map. "In my experience." A pause. "Yes," Naomi said finally. "They are." They stood near the wall together, not especially close, just side by side, and Douglas asked her about the Merivale file, and she asked him about the highway corridor project, and they talked in the way that people talk when they have something real to talk about, which is to say they forgot, for a stretch of minutes, that anyone else was in the room. He noticed the moment the room noticed them. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was a shift in the quality of attention, the way a few conversations paused and then resumed at a slightly different angle. Catherine Morrow from the partner's office, who had been watching the east wall with the specific focus of someone keeping score, visibly recalculated. Douglas had been at Sutherland Group long enough to know that Catherine Morrow's opinions rippled outward in ways that mattered. He had also been at Sutherland Group long enough not to care very much. Naomi felt it too. He could see it in the slight change in her posture. "You know," she said, lowering her voice just slightly, "you didn't have to do this." "Do what?" She looked at him steadily. "Come over here." Douglas considered this. "No," he said. "I suppose I didn't." He let that sit for a moment, which was a habit of his, letting true statements occupy the space they deserved without decoration. "Are you enjoying the party otherwise?" he asked. Something almost a smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "The crab cakes are good. They're always good," he agreed. "That's the one reliable thing." It was close to 8 o'clock when Keith Belanger materialized at Douglas's elbow with the air of someone arriving at an event they hadn't been invited to. Keith was 61, had survived 4 changes in senior leadership, and possessed an almost biological sensitivity to shifts in the firm's social weather. He looked at Douglas and then at Naomi and then back at Douglas, and Douglas could see him running some internal calculation. "Douglas," Keith said. "Keith," Douglas said. "You know Naomi Clearwater from contracts." a flicker of something across Keith's face. "Of course," he said, in the voice people use when they're committing to a position they haven't fully worked out. He shook Naomi's hand with more formality than the situation required. "Good to have you here." "Thank you," Naomi said. Keith made polite noise for 2 minutes and then drifted back toward the bar, and Douglas watched him go with the mild satisfaction of a man who had seen this particular calculation made before and was not surprised by the result. Naomi watched him go too. "He'll tell 3 people," she said quietly. "Probably 4, Douglas said. She turned to look at him then, a real look, the kind that takes a moment and means something. "Why," she said, "I mean that genuinely. You're not the type who needs the credit for it." He thought about how to answer that. He wasn't the type who answered personal questions quickly. "I had a daughter who was 11 when her mother and I separated," he said finally. "I spent a lot of that year watching people decide which side they were on, and I watched the way those decisions added up. Not to anything dramatic, just to a kind of weight." He paused. "I'm familiar with the weight." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 5 years ago. Meredith is fine. She's better than fine." He said this with the particular certainty of a man who checked frequently to make sure it was true. "But the weight I remember." She nodded slowly, looking out at the room. "My daughter is 9, she said, Petra. She has her father's last name, which is—" She stopped. "Never mind, it's a long story. Those are usually the interesting ones." She looked at him sideways, and this time what appeared at the corner of her mouth was unambiguously a smile, and it changed her face considerably. The quartet finished one song and started another, something slower, and on the cleared section of parquet near the windows, 2 or 3 couples began to move. It was the kind of dancing that happened at corporate events, which is to say careful and self-conscious and aware of being observed, but still dancing. "I used to dance," Naomi said. She didn't say it to Douglas in particular, more to herself, the way people admit things they've set down somewhere and then can't find. Douglas considered the parquet. He was not, by temperament, a man who danced at company events. He had done it precisely twice in 11 years, both times at Christmas parties in the early years, before he understood himself well enough to understand what cost him energy and what didn't. He looked at her. "Would you like to?" he said. She looked at him with genuine surprise. "Here, now? The floor is right there." A pause that lasted long enough for him to wonder if he had miscalculated. "Yes," Naomi said. "All right." They walked out to the parquet together, and Douglas was aware, with the peripheral awareness of someone who has spent years making structural assessments, of the way the room adjusted. Conversations paused. Eyes moved. Catherine Morrow turned from the person she was speaking with and watched with an expression that had moved past calculation into something closer to reassessment. 2 women near the bar. Douglas recognized one of them as someone from the accounts team who had passed Naomi without stopping earlier. Exchanged a look that was not comfortable. Good, Douglas thought, with a quietness that surprised even him. He wasn't much of a dancer. He was steady and unhurried, and he paid attention, which counts for a great deal, and Naomi was good enough that it didn't matter. They moved through 2 songs without speaking much. There wasn't much that needed saying. At some point during the second song, he became aware that the floor had filled in around them. Other couples, the usual orbiting of a party as it found its rhythm. But what had changed was the quality of the orbit. A man from the planning division named Roy Tamblin, who was the kind of person who read the room before he committed to any position in it, had drifted over to the edge of the parquet and was now watching them with visible approval. Keith Belanger had, in fact, said something to 3 people. Douglas could tell by the way those 3 people were now looking at Naomi with different eyes. It shouldn't take that, Douglas thought. It shouldn't take a man standing beside her in public for people to remember she was a person. But it did, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise, and what he could do was stand beside her. When the song ended, they stepped off the floor, and Naomi got a fresh glass of wine, and Douglas got another sparkling water, and they stood together near the windows, and the fine dry snow was still falling outside, and the streetlights were still making it look like static. "Thank you," Naomi said. She said it plainly, without the careful hedging she'd used earlier. "The crab cakes really are reliable," Douglas said. She laughed, a real one, short, caught off guard. It was the first time he'd heard it, and it was a good sound. "I didn't expect this evening to go this way," she said. "Neither did I," he admitted. I almost didn't come. What made you? My manager sent 3 reminder emails. That's very romantic, she said deadpan. He's not a romantic person, Douglas said. She laughed again, quieter this time, and looked out at the snow. Her posture was different now than it had been at 8 o'clock. Not rigid, not held in place by effort. Something had released. Petra has a recital on Saturday, she said, not quite out of nowhere. She's been practicing the same piece for 2 months. I've heard it approximately 400 times. What piece? For Elise. She paused. At roughly 60% of the correct tempo. At 60% of the correct tempo, it's a completely different piece, Douglas said. It is, she agreed, but she knows every note. She hasn't skipped one, not once. She just takes her time with them. He looked at her. She was still looking at the snow. She sounds like a serious person, he said. She is. Naomi's voice went soft in the way parents' voices go when they say something that is actually about love. She takes everything seriously. I don't know where she got it from. You might, Douglas said. A pause. Maybe, she said. They stayed by the window for another half hour. The party moved through its final hour around them, and they stood in their own pocket of it, talking. About the city. About the particular challenge of explaining work to children who have inherited your curiosity, but not your patience for bureaucratic process. About the Rideau Canal and whether it would be a good skating year. About the fact that the crab cakes had been replenished twice, and that this was, objectively, the correct decision. They talked the way people talk when they've accidentally crossed into the territory of a real conversation, and neither of them is willing to be the one to end it. Douglas did not ask for her number. He was not the kind of man who moved fast, and he had learned, slowly, the way he'd learned most things, that what was worth having was worth being careful with. He had also spent enough years in structural engineering to know that foundations mattered, that what you built on the surface was only as reliable as what you had built underneath. What he knew, standing by those windows, was that he had come to this party with the intention of leaving by 9:30, and it was now 10 past 10, and he didn't want to leave, and he hadn't felt that at a Sutherland Group event in as long as he could remember. Roy Tamblyn stopped by on his way to the coat check and shook Naomi's hand with genuine warmth and said a few things about a contract file they'd apparently worked on 18 months ago, and Naomi responded with the kind of precise recall that told Douglas she had always been sharp in rooms like this, that sharpness had not been the problem. When Roy left, Douglas watched her watch him go. Better? He said. Don't, she said, but not unkindly. I don't want to need it to feel better. No, he said. That's fair. A pause. It does feel better, she said. I'm not going to lie about that. You don't strike me as someone who lies. She looked at him. You've known me for 2 hours. I've known of you for 3 years, he said. And the subclause on the Merivale tender was real. You don't fake that kind of attention. She held his gaze for a moment with the particular expression of someone recalibrating again, not defensively but genuinely, the way you recalibrate when something lands differently than you expected. Thank you, she said again. For the 3rd time. Each time it had meant something slightly different. They got their coats at 10:20 and stood in the marble foyer while the coat check attendant worked through a backlog. Outside the tall glass doors, the snow had thickened from fine drift to something with real presence, the kind that muffled sound and softened edges. 2 cabs pulled up in quick succession. Well, Naomi said. Well, Douglas said. They stood for a moment in the comfortable awkwardness of a conversation that has gone long enough to matter and doesn't know how to land. Petra's recital is at 2 on Saturday, she said. She said it to the floor. Then she looked up. You'd be welcome to. I mean, I don't know your. She stopped. She won't play it the way Beethoven intended, but she won't miss a note. Douglas thought about the tracing paper and the tectonic plates and the Wednesday evenings when Meredith talked without stopping. He thought about what it felt like to sit in an audience and watch your child do something seriously. I don't have Meredith this weekend, he said. What time does it start? 2, she said. St. Augustine's on Somerset. I'll be there, he said. Simple as that. No performance of casualness. No hedge. No condition. Just a statement of what he intended. She looked at him for a moment. She's going to play it too slowly, she said. I'll pay close attention to every note, he said. A cab pulled up. The coat check attendant appeared with her coat, and Douglas helped her with it without being asked and without making a point of it, the way you do things that are simply what you do. She said goodnight and went out through the glass doors and got in the cab, and he watched it pull away into the snow. He stood in the foyer for a moment after. Keith appeared from somewhere to his left, also coated, also waiting. "Good evening," Keith said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has many opinions and has decided to voice none of them. "Keith," Douglas said, "Miss Clearwater seems well." "She is," Douglas said. Keith considered this. Douglas let him consider it. "You know," Keith said, "I don't actually know much about her work." "She's very good," Douglas said. "She flagged the subclause issue on the Merivale tender last spring." A pause. "Right," Keith said. "I remember that." He didn't, and they both knew it, but Douglas let that go too. Because the thing about small corrections was that you didn't need to win them all, only the ones that mattered. His cab came. He went out into the snow, and the city was quiet the way Ottawa gets quiet in November, when the snow is falling heavily enough to absorb the sound of it. And the streets were orange under the lights, and the Rideau Club receded behind him, and he sat back in the seat and did not check his phone. He thought about Saturday. 2:00, St. Augustine's on Somerset. He thought about a 9-year-old who had learned every note. He thought about the way Naomi had said, she takes everything seriously in the voice parents use when they're actually talking about love. And he thought that this was probably one of the things worth paying attention to, the way he paid attention to the small things that held large things up. The snow came down around the cab, fine and steady, and the streets were orange and white, and somewhere across the city a woman was going home to a daughter who would play Fur Elise in the morning at 60% of the correct tempo, hitting every note, not skipping a single one. Douglas Hartwell looked out the window and let himself, quietly, look forward to Saturday.